In the annals of Chicago's South Side history, few stories have garnered as much whispered reverence as that of Reverend Marcus Sullivan, a man whose past remained shadowed until one fateful autumn evening in 2019 changed everything. They say the deadliest predators are the ones who walk among us unnoticed, and no one understood this better than the quiet preacher who spent his days tending to the lost souls of Hope's Cross Chapel. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable tale, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will reveal another stunning story of redemption that you won't want to miss. In the heart of Chicago's roughest neighborhood, where sirens served as nightly lullabies and steel bars dressed every window, Hope's Cross Chapel stood as a humble beacon of light. Its whitewashed walls, though chipped and weathered, somehow remained untouched by the graffiti that claimed every other surface in sight. The locals said it wasn't just faith that protected those walls. It was the quiet man who walked through them every morning at precisely 6 a.m., his collar starched white against his dark skin, his eyes carrying a weight that spoke of burdens too heavy for most to comprehend. Detective Sarah Chen of Chicago PD's 21st District had watched Reverend Sullivan for months, not out of suspicion but curiosity. "There's two kinds of calm in this city," she wrote in her personal journal, "the kind that comes from innocence and the kind that's earned through fire." Sullivan had the second kind, the type that makes hardened gangbangers cross the street. When they see him coming, the first person to glimpse behind the Reverend's peaceful facade was Dr. Michael Torres, who ran the free clinic 2 blocks from Hope's Cross. Late one night, while treating Sullivan for what the preacher claimed was a kitchen accident, Torres noticed the scars, old wounds that told stories of combat zones and violence, not seminary studies. His hands, Torres later confided to Chen, they weren't just preacher's hands. The calluses spoke of someone who'd held weapons far more often than a Bible. Within a week of moving to Hope's Cross, Sullivan had established a routine as predictable as the sunrise. He opened the chapel doors at 6:15 a.m., spent mornings counseling troubled youth, afternoons running the soup kitchen, and evenings holding services for anyone seeking shelter in the Word. He spoke softly, moved with deliberate grace, and never, not once, raised his voice, even when breaking up fights outside his chapel. Maria Gonzalez, who ran the corner store across from Hope's Cross, was among the first to notice the peculiarities. "He always positioned himself with clear sightlines to every entrance," she told Detective Chen during a later investigation. "And his eyes, Dios mío, they never stopped scanning, like he was reading threats in the air itself." We started calling him Steel Eye behind his back, though never with malice. It felt more like a badge of honor. The neighborhood kids made up stories about their mysterious preacher. Some said he was a former CIA agent seeking redemption. Others whispered that he'd once been military special forces. The truth, as it turned out, would prove far more extraordinary than any of their young minds could conjure. What nobody knew, as autumn painted the Chicago streets with long shadows and early darkness, was that 6 men were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The garrison crew, fresh out of Stateville Correctional and hungry to reclaim their territory, had marked Hope's Cross Chapel for their first major score. They'd watched the quiet preacher, noting his gentle demeanor, cataloging what they mistook for weakness. "Easy, Mark," Derek Garrison told his crew, watching Sullivan help an elderly woman up the chapel steps. "God's man ain't gonna put up no fight when we clean out them donation boxes." If only they'd looked closer, they might have noticed how Sullivan's practiced eye had already marked every member of their crew, how his gentle assistance of the elderly woman never once compromised his awareness of their surveillance. But they didn't look closer. They didn't see the steel beneath the cloth, the warrior behind the words of peace. They would learn, as others had before them, that sometimes the most dangerous waters are the ones that appear the calmest. Stay tuned as we uncover how a man of God became Chicago's most unlikely guardian and why the night of October 15th would forever change how the South Side viewed their quiet preacher. And if you're finding this story compelling, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. Detective Sarah Chen's investigation files would later reveal that the signs were there all along, subtle warnings that the garrison crew had been too arrogant to heed. 2 weeks before they marked Hope's Cross Chapel, an incident occurred that should have made them reconsider their target. If you're just joining us, you might want to pause and check out part 1 of this incredible story, because what happened next would send shockwaves through Chicago's criminal underworld. It was a Tuesday evening, just as the soup kitchen was closing, when 3 young gangbangers tried to shake down one of Sullivan's regulars right on the chapel steps. The incident itself lasted less than 30 seconds, but those who witnessed it never forgot what they saw. The preacher had moved with liquid precision, his hands empty, but somehow more threatening than any weapon. No punches were thrown, no voices raised, but something in his stance and the cold certainty in his steel-gray eyes had made 3 armed teenagers back down and apologize. "It wasn't what he did," explained Marcus Williams, a former gang member who'd found refuge in Hope's Cross. "It was how he did it, like a man who knew exactly how many ways he could end that situation and was choosing the most merciful one." Williams paused, his face thoughtful. "That's when I started wondering, what kind of preacher knows how to stand like a shooter?" The question would have interested Derek Garrison had he bothered to ask around. Fresh out of Stateville, after a 5-year stint for armed robbery, Garrison was too focused on re-establishing his crew's dominance to pay attention to such subtle warnings. His younger brother, Tony, had managed their territory while he was away. But the neighborhood had changed. New players had moved in, and the Garrison name no longer carried the weight it once did. "The chapel's got to be pulling in at least $5,000 a week in donations," Derek told his crew, gathered in the back room of the Rusty Nail, a dive bar 3 blocks from Hope's Cross. "All cash, minimal security, plus whatever they got stashed from that building fund they've been running." He took a long pull from his beer, eyes hard with determination. "We hit it right. We send a message to the whole neighborhood. Show 'em the Garrisons are back in business." What Derek couldn't know was that at that exact moment, Reverend Sullivan was in his small office behind the chapel, field stripping and cleaning a custom M1911 with the same methodical precision he brought to polishing the communion chalice. The weapon, like the man himself, told a story few would believe, its serial number marking it as property of the U.S. Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, its grips worn smooth by years of use in places the government denied existing. Dr. Torres, making a late-night house call to check on Sullivan's kitchen wound, caught a glimpse of the weapon before the preacher could secure it. "I'm no gun expert," Torres would later tell Detective Chen, "but I know military hardware when I see it. That piece wasn't some street cannon. It was a precision tool, like a surgeon's scalpel, and the way his hands moved over it. The vast doctor shook his head. Those were the hands of a man who'd spent more time with steel than scripture. The truth about Reverend Marcus Sullivan, the full story of who he was and what he'd done before finding his calling, remained locked, behind eyes that had seen too much and lips that rarely smiled. But as October winds swept autumn leaves down South Side streets, as Derek Garrison and his crew finalized their plans, those secrets were about to explode into the open with the force of a high-caliber round. Maria Gonzalez, closing her store, that night, watched Sullivan walk his usual evening patrol around the chapel grounds. Something was different, she recalled, like animals before an earthquake, you know. He knew something was coming. The way he checked the doors, the windows, it wasn't his usual routine. It was like he was preparing. What none of them realized was that Reverend Sullivan had already marked every member of Garrison's crew. He'd noted their patterns, their weaknesses, their tendencies. not out of malice or fear, but with the dispassionate precision of a man who'd spent years learning the geometry of violence. As he knelt in prayer that night, his words were not just for divine protection, they were an apology for what he knew would soon be necessary. The stage was set. The players were in motion, and in less than 24 hours, the South Side would learn why some shepherds are chosen not for their ability to lead the flock, but for their capacity to confront the wolves. If this story has gripped you so far, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about redemption and justice. The morning of October 15th dawned cold and grey over Chicago's South Side, the kind of autumn day when steel-colored clouds hung low enough to brush the tops of the city's aging buildings. Inside Hope's Cross Chapel, Reverend Sullivan went about, his morning routine with characteristic precision, though those who knew him best might have noticed subtle differences. Before we dive deeper into the events that would shake the South Side's foundations, make sure you've caught up with parts 1 and 2 of this extraordinary tale. Detective Chen, reviewing security footage from Maria's corner store, later noted that Sullivan's usual 6 a.m. arrival was delayed by exactly 7 minutes, the only time in 3 years he'd deviated from his schedule. Looking back, Chen wrote in her report, he was positioning himself. Every movement, every pause, he was setting the stage for what he knew was coming. The garrison crew had spent the night finalizing their plans in a rented garage off 35th Street. Derek Garrison, confident in the simplicity of their approach, laid it out one final time. Me, Tony, and Marcus hit the front. Joey and Rick take the back. Kevin watches the street. He checked the modified Glock in his waistband, a habit from his previous life that prison hadn't broken. In and out in 5 minutes. No shots if we can help it. Don't need that kind of heat. What Derek couldn't know was that Sullivan had already read their intentions in a dozen tiny details. The way they cased the chapel, their patrol patterns, even their choice of vehicles. 20 years earlier, in another life, he'd taught young Marines to observe these same patterns in far deadlier environments. The thing about violence, Sullivan had once told a troubled youth during counseling, is that it follows predictable geometries. Like any language, it has its grammar, its syntax. The trick isn't learning to speak it, it's learning when to stay silent. The boy hadn't understood then. Many would understand all too well before the day was over. By 10 a.m., Hope's Cross was unusually quiet. The regular morning crowd of elderly parishioners and struggling mothers seeking assistance was noticeably absent. Later, several would recall receiving calls from Sullivan himself, suggesting they might want to visit the food bank over on 39th Street instead, just for today. Dr. Torres, arriving to check on a sick parishioner, found the chapel. Doors locked. Another unprecedented departure from routine. Through the stained glass windows, he glimpsed Sullivan moving purposefully through the nave, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something more focused, more lethal. "I served 2 tours as a combat medic," Torres later testified. "I know what a soldier looks like when he's preparing for engagement." That morning, Sullivan wasn't moving like a preacher. He was moving like an operator, checking his angles of fire. Inside the chapel, Sullivan had been methodically preparing since dawn. The leather-bound Bible on the pulpit concealed a custom-built radio scanner, tracking the cheap walkie-talkies the garrison crew used to coordinate. Behind the altar, within easy reach, his M1911 waited like a patient serpent. Each pew had been subtly adjusted, creating clear lanes through the chapel's interior. Maria Gonzalez, opening her store across the street, noticed other changes. The usually immaculate sidewalk in front of Hope's Cross was suddenly littered with scattered leaves and debris, obstacles that would force anyone approaching to watch their feet instead of their surroundings. The chapel's ancient security lights, dark for months, had been carefully repositioned. It was like watching someone set up a chessboard, she told Detective Chen. Only later did I realize we were seeing a master strategist preparing his battlefield. By 11 a.m., Derek Garrison's crew was in motion. They'd chosen their timing carefully, late enough for the morning rush to be over, early enough to avoid the lunch crowd at the soup kitchen. Their 2 vehicles, stolen the night before, approached from opposite directions. None of them noticed how the scattered debris would force them to bunch up at the chapel steps, or how the adjusted security lights would throw confused shadows across their planned escape route. In his office, Sullivan knelt in prayer one final time. The words were familiar, but the context was something only a handful of people in the world would have understood. The same prayer he'd whispered in 100 sniper hides in places officially. Labeled classified or denied, the stage was set. 6 men, believing they were about to rob a simple preacher, were minutes away from learning why some of God's servants are chosen not for their capacity for peace, but for their mastery of righteous violence. Stay with us, because in the next part of this incredible story, you'll witness how faith and precision can become instruments of divine retribution. The first sign that the Garrison crew's plan was unraveling came at precisely 11:07 a.m., though none of them recognized it at the time. If you're just joining us, take a moment to catch up on the previous parts of this extraordinary tale, because what happened next would become the stuff of Southside legend. Kevin Reese, youngest of the crew and designated lookout, had positioned himself near Maria's corner store with a clear view of the chapel's entrance. He was the first to notice something odd about the scene before him. "Streets too quiet," he muttered into his cheap walkie-talkie, "like everybody knows to stay away." Derek Garrison, already approaching the chapel steps with Tony and Marcus, dismissed the warning with a harsh whisper. "Stick to the plan. Nobody knows nothing." But Kevin's instincts, honed by years on Chicago's streets, were screaming at him. Later, he would be the only member of the crew to escape unscathed, and his testimony would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. Inside Hope's Cross, Reverend Sullivan stood motionless in the shadows near the altar, his breathing steady and controlled. Through the stained glass windows, filtered sunlight painted patterns across the worn floorboards, patterns he had memorized, measured, and factored into his calculations. Each beam of light marked a distance, each shadow a potential point of cover. It wasn't just preparation, Detective Chen would later write in her analysis. It was orchestration. He'd turned the entire chapel into a combat theater where he controlled every variable. The Garrison crew thought they were executing a simple robbery. They were actually walking into a masterclass in tactical superiority. At 11:09 a.m., Joey and Rick, tasked with covering the rear entrance, found the back door unlocked. Their first stroke of apparent luck. They didn't notice how the door's hinges had been subtly adjusted to make it open silently, or how the mornings scattered. Debris had subtly channeled them toward specific approaches. "Everything's set back here," Joey radioed, his voice carrying clearly over Sullivan's scanner. "No movement inside." Derek gave the signal, and the crew moved in. Tony and Marcus flanked him as they mounted the front steps, their boots crunching on scattered leaves. The chapel's heavy wooden doors swung open with well-oiled silence. The interior was dim, peaceful, seemingly empty, except for the usual trappings of worship. Dr. Torres, watching discreetly from his clinic window, observed the entire approach. Their formation was sloppy, he noted later, bunched too close together. Nobody watching the high angles. Any combat vet would have spotted a dozen fatal flaws in their approach. Sullivan had to have seen the same things. The crew's entry might have seemed smooth to amateur eyes, but to Sullivan it was like watching a training exercise in everything not to do. Their weapons were carried too loosely, their spacing too tight, their awareness focused forward instead of scanning their surroundings. They moved like men who expected to find nothing but an easy target. What they found instead was an empty nave. the morning light streaming through stained glass to illuminate vacant pews. The silence was absolute, broken only by their cautious footsteps on ancient floorboards. Derek gestured toward the office behind the altar, where they expected to find the chapel's safe and its contents. "Check the basement," he whispered to Joey and Rick. "Pastor's office is up here, 5 minutes, in and out." That's when they heard it, the soft click of the front doors closing behind them. It wasn't the sound itself that froze them in place. It was the finality of it, the quiet precision that spoke of purpose rather than accident. Before any of them could react, a voice cut through the silence, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your souls may still find redemption." Reverend Sullivan's voice carried clearly through the chapel's perfect acoustics. "But first, there must be penance." The trap was sprung. The garrison crew, who had come expecting to find an easy mark, were about to discover why some shepherds are chosen not for their gentleness with the flock, but for their ability to deal with wolves. Stay with us, because what happens next will demonstrate why the deadliest predator isn't always the one holding the most weapons, but the one who knows exactly how to use what God has given him. If this story has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe. The next part will show you why some men of peace are best left undisturbed. The next 30 seconds in Hope's Cross Chapel would later be described by Kevin Reese as watching wolves realize they'd walked into a lion's den. If you haven't caught up with our previous segments, you might want to pause here, because what happened next would fundamentally change how Chicago's criminal underworld viewed men of the cloth. Derek Garrison's first instinct was to establish control through intimidation, a strategy that had served him well in countless other situations. "Show yourself, preacher!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the chapel's high ceiling. "Don't try to be a hero." The words had barely left his lips when the first demonstration of Sullivan's capabilities left everyone in the chapel frozen in disbelief. A single shot rang out, its report oddly muffled, and Derek's Glock seemed to leap from his hand, spinning across the wooden floor to disappear under a pew. The precision of the shot, striking the weapon's slide without touching Derek's hand, would later be described by forensics as practically impossible, given the angle and lighting conditions. That was a warning. Sullivan's voice came. Again, still seemingly from everywhere. "The next one won't be." Tony Garrison, younger and quicker to anger than his brother, made the crew's first fatal mistake. He spun toward the sound, raising his weapon toward the altar area. The second shot came before his arm was fully extended. The bullet struck his shoulder, not a killing shot, but one precisely placed to disable without risking a fatal bleed-out. He wasn't just shooting, Detective Chen would later explain after reviewing the scene. He was conducting a symphony of controlled violence. Each shot had a purpose, each wound carefully calculated. This wasn't random fire. This was surgery with a bullet. Joey and Rick, hearing the shots from their position near the basement stairs, made their move toward the front of the chapel. They'd barely covered 10 feet when the air was split by 2 more shots in rapid succession. Both men went down, clutching their legs. Again, the wounds precisely placed to incapacitate without threatening their lives. "The Lord speaks of turning the other cheek." Sullivan's voice carried a tone of almost professorial calm. "But he also speaks of casting money changers from the temple. Today, you'll learn the difference." Marcus, who'd served time with Derek and fancied himself the crew's tactical expert, tried to use the pews for cover, moving in what he thought was an unpredictable pattern. To Sullivan, whose trained eye had mapped every angle and line of sight, in the chapel over months of preparation, it might as well have been a choreographed dance. The 5th shot caught Marcus in the shoulder just as he thought he'd found a secure position. The impact spun him around, dropping him face first onto a pew. "How?" he gasped, more in confusion than pain. "There's no way. No one's that good." But Sullivan was that good. 20 years earlier, he'd graduated top of his class at Scout Sniper School, earning the nickname Gospel for his near-miraculous ability to put rounds exactly where he intended them to go. Those skills, honed in countless classified operations across the globe, hadn't diminished during his years of peaceful service. Derek Garrison, watching his crew systematically dismantled by an unseen opponent, made one last, desperate attempt. To regain control, he pulled a backup piece from his ankle holster, a snub-nosed .38 that had escaped Sullivan's initial disarming shot. "Enough games!" he shouted, grabbing one of the antique candlesticks from the nearest pew and hurling it toward the altar. The brass implement crashed against the wooden railing with a resounding clang. "Face me like a man, preacher!" "As you wish." The words came not from the chapel's hidden speakers this time, but from directly behind Derek. He spun, 38 raised, to find himself staring into eyes that had seen far more violence than he could imagine. Sullivan stood less than 3 feet away, his M1911 held with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of decades of familiarity. Stay with us, because what happens next will reveal why some men's path to redemption runs not away from violence, but straight through it. If you're as invested in this story as our global audience, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the moment when Chicago's underworld learned why some shepherds are chosen for their aim rather than their sermons. The moment stretched between Derek Garrison and Reverend Sullivan like a drawn wire, taut with tension and possibilities. If you're just joining us, take a moment to catch up with our previous segments, because this confrontation would become the stuff of Southside legend, whispered about in pool halls and back alleys for years to come. You know what's interesting about the 38 special? Sullivan's voice was conversational, almost gentle, as if he were delivering a Sunday sermon rather than facing down an armed criminal. It's a reliable weapon, been around since 1898. 6 shots, decent stopping power. He tilted his head slightly, those steel-grey eyes never leaving Derek's face. But it has this peculiar quirk when the cylinder's not properly seated. Derek's finger tightened on the trigger, just as the significance of Sullivan's words registered. The gun clicked empty. Somewhere in those fluid movements earlier, the preacher had manipulated the cylinder release without anyone noticing. The weapon was mechanically complete, but utterly useless. How? Derek's voice trailed off, his face a mask of disbelief. Behind him, Tony groaned from his position on the floor, while Marcus and the others remained where they had fallen, each nursing precisely placed wounds. 23 years as a Marine Scout sniper, Sullivan replied calmly, his own weapon still held with casual expertise. 12 of those with special operations units that didn't officially exist, another 5 training others in the art of dealing with threats. His voice took on a teaching tone. You see, before I found my calling in the church, I had another purpose. Some might say I still serve both. Dr. Torres, still watching from his clinic window across the street, would later describe what happened next to Detective Chen. It was like watching a masterclass in control. Every movement, every position. Sullivan wasn't just subduing them, he was teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. You've got 2 choices now, Sullivan continued, his M1911 never wavering. The first involves you making peace with your maker a lot sooner than you planned. The second, he reached into his clerical collar and produced a cell phone, involves a conversation with Detective Chen at the 21st. She's been building a case against your crew for months. I imagine she'd be very interested in what you could tell her about your organization's higher-level connections. Derek's mind raced, calculating angles, possibilities, desperate for an option that didn't end with either a bullet or a cell. You're bluffing, he managed, though his voice lacked conviction. No man of God would— Let me tell you about God, Sullivan interrupted, and something in his tone made everyone in the chapel hold their breath. The Bible speaks not just of peace, but of warriors. David was a killer before he was a king. Moses led his people to freedom through blood and fire. The Lord understands that sometimes shepherds must deal harshly with wolves. Through the stained glass windows, shifting clouds created patterns of light and shadow across the chapel floor. Sullivan moved through them like a spirit, his black clothing seeming to absorb the colored light. "I've sent better men than you to meet their judgment, Derek. Men who thought their cause was just, their skills superior. They all learned the same lesson. God's mercy often comes through unexpected channels." Outside, Kevin Reese, still at his lookout position, noticed movement at the corner of his eye. Detective Chen and two plainclothes officers were quietly taking up positions around the chapel. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. "Time's is up," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying that same calm certainty. "Your crew is done, Derek. The only question is whether you end this with some measure of dignity or if we need to explore those other options we discussed. Stay with us, because what happens next will show exactly why some men find their path to redemption through the most unexpected means, and how a shepherd's crook can become a warrior's staff when circumstances demand. If this story has gripped you as it has our viewers worldwide, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss the moment when Chicago's underworld learned that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one wearing a collar. Derek Garrison had faced many dark moments in his criminal career, but none quite like this. If you're just joining our story, take a moment to catch up, because the next few minutes would reshape the power dynamics of Chicago's South Side in ways nobody could have predicted. "Your pride's already wounded," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying that same unsettling calm. "But pride heals faster than bullet holes. Make the smart choice." The preacher's M1911 remained unwavering, its worn grips telling stories of countless, similar standoffs in far-off places. Outside, Detective Chen had established a perimeter, her team moving with practiced efficiency. Through her radio, she could hear the approaching sirens growing closer. "Subject is contained," she reported. "Multiple wounded inside, but according to our source, all injuries are non-lethal." The moment of decision crystallized as Derek glanced toward his wounded brother Tony, then back to Sullivan's steel-gray eyes. Something he saw there, perhaps a reflection of the violence he himself had dealt out over the years, finally broke through his bravado. "All right." Derek's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him like water from a broken vessel. "All right. Preacher, you win." The words seemed to cost him physical pain. "But I got to know. How long you been planning this? How'd you know we were coming?" Sullivan's smile was thin as a knife's edge. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he replied, though his eyes told a different story, one of careful observation, tactical planning, and the kind of patience that came from lying motionless in a sniper hide for days. Though sometimes he works through more direct channels. As if on cue, Maria Gonzalez appeared in the chapel doorway, flanked by Detective Chen. The corner store owner's face was set with grim satisfaction. "Your crew wasn't as subtle as you thought, Derek," Chen explained. "Maria's been working with us for months, documenting your organization's movements. The Reverend here just accelerated our timeline." "The corner store," Derek breathed, realization dawning. "All those cameras. Sometimes the best surveillance post is the one hiding in plain sight," Sullivan confirmed. "Maria's family has been watching this neighborhood for 3 generations. When she came to me about your crew's activities, well," he shrugged, "the Lord puts us where we're needed." Dr. Torres arrived with his medical bag, moving efficiently between the wounded men. His experienced hands confirmed what Sullivan's marksmanship had already ensured. Every injury was precisely calculated to disable without causing permanent damage. "You did this deliberately," Torres observed, examining Tony's shoulder wound. Could have killed them all, but you chose not to. Death is final, Sullivan replied, his voice carrying echoes of lessons learned in far deadlier places. Sometimes the best sermon is letting someone live with the consequences of their choices. As Chen's officers began processing the scene, a new tension rippled through the law enforcement personnel. Word had come down from higher up. Someone was very interested in how a former Marine Scout sniper had ended up preaching in one of Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. This is going to draw attention, Chen warned Sullivan quietly, the kind of attention that asks questions about past operations and classified missions. Sullivan nodded, his expression unchanged. The Lord puts us where we're needed, he repeated, though this time the words carried a different weight, and sometimes the past catches up no matter how far we run from it. Maria, overhearing the exchange, crossed herself quietly. She'd seen enough in her years watching the neighborhood to recognize when larger storms were gathering. The garrison crew's attempted robbery wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Stay with us, because what comes next will reveal how one man's attempt to leave his past behind becomes a crucible that tests not just his faith, but the very foundations of his new life. If this story has captured your attention like it has for viewers across the globe, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss how a simple preacher's defense of his flock draws the attention of forces that have been searching for the legendary gospel for a very long time. News travels fast in Chicago's underworld, carried on whispers and burner phones, but what happened at Hope's Cross Chapel traveled at the speed of legend. If you haven't caught up with our story so far, you might want to pause here, because the ripples from Reverend Sullivan's stand were about to reach places even he hadn't anticipated. By nightfall, the initial police investigation was complete. The garrison crew had been processed, their wounds treated, their statements taken. Derek's decision to cooperate had opened a floodgate of information about the neighborhood's criminal hierarchy. But in a private office at the Chicago FBI field office, a different kind of investigation was just beginning. Reverend Marcus Sullivan, Special Agent Sarah Kendricks read from a thin file, her voice carrying notes of both respect and concern. Former Marine Scout sniper, callsign Gospel, served with distinction in classified operations across 3 continents. Then suddenly, 8 years ago, he disappears completely. She looked up at her superior. Until today. Assistant Director Raymond Walsh studied the chapel's security footage, watching Sullivan's precise movements with professional appreciation. The question isn't why he disappeared, Walsh mused. The question is why he's resurfacing now. Men like Sullivan don't make mistakes with their cover. He wanted to be found. Back at Hope's Cross, Dr. Torres was helping Sullivan clean up the chapel, their movements careful around the evidence markers still dotting the floor. "They're going to come looking," Torres said quietly, his combat medic's instincts still sharp. "After all these years, the kind of people who don't like loose ends." "They've been looking for 8 years," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying that same serene calm he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "The difference is, now I'm done running." He picked up a fallen candlestick, examining the brass surface as if reading hidden messages in its patterns. "Sometimes the Lord puts us in places not just to serve, but to make a stand." Maria Gonzalez, watching from her store window as unmarked federal vehicles began appearing in the neighborhood, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She'd seen enough to recognize when powerful forces were moving in the shadows. Her security, cameras, which had helped bring down the garrison crew, were now picking up men who moved with too much precision to be ordinary agents. "Something bigger is coming," she told Detective Chen during their evening debrief. "The kind of storm that changes everything it touches." Chen understood all too well. Her own superiors had been asking pointed questions about Sullivan's background, his connection to classified operations, and most worryingly, about an incident in Kandahar that even her highest clearance level couldn't access. "Your past is reaching out," she warned Sullivan later that night, finding him in his small office behind the chapel. "Whatever happened in Kandahar, whatever made you choose this life, it's not staying buried." Sullivan's response was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Williams, the former gang member who'd found refuge at Hope's Cross. His face carried the tension of someone bearing unwelcome news. "Word spreading through the streets," Marcus reported. "The garrison crew wasn't just local muscle. They had connections, serious ones. Some people are saying they were looking for something specific in the chapel, something worth a lot more than collection box money." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in those steel-grey eyes, a tactical assessment as familiar as breathing. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly, though his hand unconsciously moved closer to his M1911. "And sometimes he puts us exactly where we need to be when the real storm arrives. Stay with us, because what comes next will reveal how one man's attempt at redemption becomes ground zero for a conflict that's been brewing in the shadows for almost a decade. If this story has gripped you like it has our global audience, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss the moment when Chicago's South Side becomes the battleground for forces that have been searching for the legendary Gospel since he vanished in the mountains of Kandahar. The truth about what happened in Kandahar began to surface on a Tuesday morning, carried in a heavily redacted file that landed on Assistant Director Walsh's desk. If you're just joining our story, you'll want to catch up with previous segments, because the shadows from Sullivan's past were about to engulf Chicago's South Side in ways no one could have predicted. "Operation Shepherd's Gate," Walsh read aloud to Agent Kendricks, his voice tight with recognition. 8 years ago, a joint CIA military operation went sideways in the mountains outside Kandahar. Official records state the mission was compromised, resulting in heavy casualties. Unofficial sources suggest something else entirely. "What was the target?" Kendricks asked, studying satellite photos of a compound that no longer existed. "Not what, who?" Walsh pulled out another document. This, one bearing more black ink than text. A banker named Victor Constantine, supposedly handling funds for various terrorist organizations. But when Sullivan's team breached the compound... He paused, his expression darkening. "They found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something that got 7 good men killed and sent gospel off the grid." At Hope's Cross, Sullivan was conducting his morning service as if nothing had changed, though keen observers might have noticed subtle differences. His sermon spoke of Daniel in the lion's den, of faith tested by fire, of standing firm when darkness gathered. Maria Gonzalez, watching from her usual pew, recognized the message beneath the message, a warrior preparing his ground. Detective Chen, attending the service for the first time, noted other changes. New faces in the congregation, sitting too, still too alert. Men with the same bearing as Sullivan, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. The shepherd was gathering his old flock, though not the kind that sought salvation through scripture. "Former operators," Torres whispered to Chen, his combat medic's instincts recognizing kindred spirits. "I count at least 5. Whatever's coming, Sullivan's not planning to face it alone." The first direct move came that afternoon. A black SUV with diplomatic plates pulled up outside the chapel. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, their movements and carrying that distinctive rhythm of professional killers trying to look civilized. "Reverend Sullivan," the older man smiled, his accent placing him somewhere in Eastern Europe. "Or do you prefer gospel? My employer was most impressed with your handling of the garrison situation. Such precision, such control. It reminded him of another display of skill years ago in Kandahar." Sullivan's response was calm, measured, but those who knew him best could see the tactical calculations running behind his eyes. "Your employer sent hired guns to a house of God." he replied softly. "He must be desperate. What he is generous." The man produced an envelope thick with cash. "The information you acquired in Kandahar, the files you took from Constantine's compound. Return them, and this unfortunate chapter can end peacefully. Continue to resist." His smile turned predatory. "Well, even men of God can have tragic accidents." The tension in the chapel could have been cut with a knife. Sullivan's hand hadn't moved toward his weapon, but somehow that made him seem even more dangerous. 8 years ago, he said quietly, I watched good men die because of what was in those files. Their blood bought something more valuable than money. It bought the truth. Truth, the man laughed. Truth is relative, Reverend. Power, on the other hand. His hand moved slightly, revealing the bulge of a shoulder holster. Power is absolute. So is faith, Sullivan replied, and something in his tone made both men take an involuntary step back. Your employer should remember that before he brings his war to my chapel. Stay with us, because what happens next will reveal how the sins of the past become the battles of the present, and why some secrets are worth dying or killing to protect. If this story has captured your attention like it has for viewers worldwide, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what happens when a man of God must decide between keeping his newfound peace and exposing a truth that could shake foundations of power across the globe. The two men from the black SUV hadn't been gone an hour when the truth about Victor Constantine began to unravel. If you haven't caught up with our story so far, you'll want to pause here, because what happened next would shake the foundations of power from Chicago to the mountains of Afghanistan. It was never about terrorist funding, Sullivan explained to Detective Chen in his office, his voice carrying the weight of long-buried memories. The setting sun through the chapel windows cast long shadows across his face, aging him beyond his years. Constantine was running a different kind of operation, one that implicated people far more dangerous than any terrorist cell. Chen studied the single photograph Sullivan had placed on his desk. A team of operators posed in front of a transport helicopter, their faces obscured by tactical gear. Only Sullivan was identifiable, younger but carrying the same steel in his eyes. Your team, she said softly. The ones who died in Kandahar. They died for what we found in that compound, Sullivan confirmed, his finger tracing the outline of each man in the photo. Financial records, surveillance files, video evidence, proof that some of the highest offices in multiple governments were profiting from human trafficking. Constantine wasn't just a banker, he was a bookkeeper for monsters. At the FBI field office, Agent Kendricks was piecing together similar conclusions. The garrison crew wasn't just hitting the chapel for cash, she reported to Walsh. They were looking for a specific safe, one that wasn't installed by the church. She spread photographs across his desk, showing X-ray scans of the chapel's walls. There's a military-grade vault hidden behind the altar, installed 8 years ago, right when Sullivan arrived. Walsh's face was grim. The files from Kandahar, he said. He didn't just disappear with them. He's been protecting them, using his cover as a preacher to guard evidence that could bring down administrations. Outside Hope's Cross, Maria Gonzalez's security cameras captured increasing activity. More unmarked vehicles cruising past. More men with that distinct military bearing, taking up positions around the neighborhood. The storm Sullivan had prepared for was gathering strength. They're setting up a perimeter, observed one of Sullivan's former teammates, now posing as a homeless man on Maria's doorstep. Like others from his past, he'd appeared as if summoned when word of the chapel incident spread. Classic containment formation. They're not just coming for the files, they're coming for everyone who knows about them. Dr. Torres, treating a young parishioner's scraped knee, noted similar signs. His combat medics training recognized the pattern. Medical vehicles positioned, too precisely, ambulance crews that moved more like tactical teams. They're preparing for casualties, he told Sullivan during their evening meeting. Whatever's coming, they expect resistance. Sullivan's response was to increase his own preparations. The chapel's basement, already a soup kitchen and shelter, became an impromptu command center. Former operators, drawn by loyalty to their old team leader, filtered in using the tunnel network that honeycombed the neighborhood's Prohibition-era foundations. "Your past is calling in its debts," Marcus Williams observed, watching Sullivan check weapon caches hidden behind false walls. "These men, they're here for more than just the files, aren't they? They're here because 8 years ago we made a promise," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying echoes of that fatal day in Kandahar. "That the truth wouldn't stay buried, that those 7 lives wouldn't be lost in vain. Sometimes," he added, checking the action on his M1911, "redemption comes through revolution. Stay with us, because what happens next will reveal how one man's quest for redemption becomes a battle for justice that reaches from the streets of Chicago to the corridors of power." If this story has gripped you like it has our global audience, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what happens when a shepherd must decide between protecting his current flock and avenging the one he lost in the mountains of Kandahar. Dawn broke over Chicago's south side with an unnatural quiet, the kind that precedes not just storms, but battles. If you're just joining our story, you'll want to catch up, because the next 12 hours would transform a neighborhood church into ground zero for a conflict 8 years in the making. "They'll come at dusk," Sullivan explained to the gathered group in the chapel basement. His former teammates, now positioned throughout the neighborhood, listened via encrypted radio channels that Detective Chen had quietly provided. Standard, tactical approach. They'll use the failing light to mask their initial movements. Agent Kendricks, monitoring chatter from her position in the FBI command center, reached the same conclusion. "Multiple teams converging," she reported to Walsh. "Private military contractors, some with diplomatic cover. They're setting up for a major operation, but keeping it off official channels." "Of course they are," Walsh replied grimly. "If Sullivan's files contain what we think they do, this isn't just about cleaning up old operations. This is about protecting people in positions to bury investigations, erase evidence, make witnesses disappear." At her corner store, Maria Gonzalez watched the subtle dance of preparation through her network of cameras. Men in civilian clothes, but military-bearing, establishing positions in abandoned buildings. Communications equipment being staged on rooftops. Even the local gang members had gone to ground, sensing the gathering storm. "They're creating a kill box," Torres observed, using his medical rounds as cover to survey the neighborhood. His combat. Medics' experience recognized the tactical layout. Cutting off all approaches, preparing for a siege, but something's wrong with their positioning. Sullivan saw it too. From his chapel office, he studied the enemy deployments with the eye of a man who'd spent years reading battlefield geometry. "They think they're setting a trap," he told Chen during their secure morning briefing. "But they're reading the ground wrong. This neighborhood isn't just buildings and streets. It's a century of survival built in brick and concrete." The truth of his words lay beneath their feet. The Prohibition era had left Hope's Cross honeycombed with tunnels, secret rooms, and hidden passages. For 8 years, Sullivan hadn't just been playing preacher. He'd been preparing this ground, marking every escape route, every defensive position, every angle of attack and retreat. "Your team," Chen observed, watching Sullivan's former operators move through the neighborhood with practiced invisibility. "They're not just here for the files, are they? They're here because of what happened after Kandahar," Sullivan replied, checking the action on his M1911 with mechanical precision. "When we found those files, we made 2 promises. First, that the truth would come out. Second," his eyes took on that distant look that spoke of battles fought in classified shadows, "that we'd make them pay for our brothers' blood." By mid-afternoon, the tension had reached a breaking point. Marcus Williams, running reconnaissance from the church's bell tower, reported increased movement. Black SUVs pulling into positions. Men with hardware that doesn't match their civilian clothes. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They don't need to, Agent Kendricks told Walsh, watching the same movements from surveillance footage. Whatever's in Sullivan's files, it's worth burning down half of Chicago to keep it quiet. The people behind this, they're not just cleaning up loose ends, they're sending a message. In his office, Sullivan knelt in prayer one final time. The worn photo of his team in Kandahar lay before him, 7 faces that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. Sometimes, he whispered, though, whether to God or his fallen brothers wasn't clear, redemption comes through revolution. Stay with us, because what happens next will reveal how one neighborhood becomes a battleground between forces that operate in shadows and a shepherd who's decided that some sins can only be cleansed through fire. If this story has captivated you like it has our global audience, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss the moment when a man of God proves that sometimes the most righteous path leads straight through the valley of death. The attack began at dusk, but not in the way anyone expected. If you haven't caught up with our story, you'll want to pause here, because what happened next would become a tactical legend studied in places where such lessons are learned in blood. The first move came not from the mercenaries surrounding Hope's Cross, but from Sullivan himself. As shadows lengthened across Chicago's south side, the chapel's evening bells began to toll, not the usual call to prayer, but a complex pattern that meant nothing to most listeners. Signals going out, Agent Kendricks reported, watching. From the FBI command post, a sudden movement erupted across their surveillance feeds. Throughout the neighborhood, seemingly random civilians, the homeless man near Maria's store, a construction worker, 2 elderly men playing chess in the park, transformed into combat operators with fluid precision. He's had sleeper teams in place for days, Walsh realized, watching the tactical situation reshape itself on their monitors. The whole neighborhood is his kill zone, and we just watched their perimeter turn inside out. The mercenary teams, professional enough to recognize when positions were compromised, initiated their contingency plans. Black-clad figures began moving toward pre-designated rally points, only to find those positions already occupied by Sullivan's operators. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Sullivan's voice came across their tactical frequencies, courtesy of communication equipment that wasn't supposed to exist outside of classified military channels. But geometry is always precise. In her corner store, Maria Gonzalez watched the opening moves of this deadly chess game through her camera network. She saw how Sullivan had positioned his people to herd the enemy into prepared channels, using the neighborhood's architecture to funnel movement exactly where he wanted it. He's not just fighting them, Detective Chen observed, watching alongside Maria. He's conducting an orchestra of violence. Every piece placed exactly where it needs to be. Every movement calculated for maximum effect. The first real exchange of gunfire came from the abandoned textile factory 3 blocks from Hope's Cross. A mercenary team, attempting to establish a sniper position, found themselves engaged by operators who seemed to materialize from the shadows. The firefight was brief, precise, and entirely one-sided. "These aren't just former operators," Torres reported from his clinic, where he'd prepared for casualties that hadn't yet materialized. "These are the best of the best, the kind of men who train the trainers." Sullivan's called in every marker, every old debt. In the chapel basement, Sullivan monitored the situation through equipment that would have looked more at home in a military command center than a church. Marcus Williams, watching him coordinate the defense, finally understood. What he was seeing, "You never stopped being gospel," Marcus said softly. "All these years, the preaching, the community work, it was real, but it wasn't the whole truth." "The Lord gives us many pulpits," Sullivan replied, his hands moving over communication gear with practiced efficiency. "Sometimes the sermon is in the silence between shots. Above ground, the mercenary teams were learning hard lessons about urban warfare. Every approach to the chapel had become a killing ground. Every apparent advantage revealed as a carefully laid trap. Sullivan's men, moving through the neighborhood's secret passages and forgotten tunnels, seemed to appear and disappear at will. "They're falling back," Agent Kendricks reported, watching the tactical displays, regrouping for a concentrated push. Her voice carried notes of both professional admiration and concern. "But something's wrong. This is too easy." Sullivan, hearing the same reports, reached the same conclusion. "They wanted us to thin our lines," he told his team. "The real attack's coming from—" He paused, his warrior's instincts screaming a warning just as new signals began lighting up his displays. "Stay with us, because what happens next will show why some battles are won, not through superior firepower, but through understanding the true nature of sacrifice." If this story has gripped you like it has our global audience, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss the moment when a shepherd must decide between protecting his flock and revealing a truth that could set the world on fire. The real attack came from below, erupting from tunnels that even Sullivan hadn't known existed. If you're just joining our story, you'll want to catch up, because what happened next would reveal that some secrets run deeper than even the most. Carefully laid plans. They're using the old subway maintenance tunnels. Maria's voice crackled over the secure channel, her cameras picking up movement from access points that hadn't appeared on any modern map. Coming up through the abandoned station under 5th Street. Sullivan's response was immediate, but controlled, the battle calm that had earned him his reputation settling over him like a familiar coat. "Marcus, get the files from the vault. Detective. Jen, your people need to move now. Everyone else fall back to position Alpha. We're about to have company." In the FBI command center, Agent Kendricks watched as new players entered the field. "These aren't the same operators," she reported, studying their movement patterns. "Different training, different equipment. These are ghost teams," Walsh finished grimly. "Wet work specialists, the kind governments use when they need something to never have happened." He reached for his phone, then stopped. "Whatever's in those files, it's bigger than we thought. These teams don't deploy without direct authorization from—" His voice trailed off as realization hit. Some names weren't meant to be spoken aloud, even in secure facilities. Underground, the ghost teams moved with lethal precision through the maintenance tunnels, their advanced equipment cutting through the darkness like digital scalpels. But Sullivan had spent 8 years preparing for this moment, and even the shadows held surprises for those who thought they owned the dark. The first team hit a prepared defensive position less than 50 yards from their entry point. Sullivan's operators, using old Prohibition-era gun ports concealed in the tunnel walls, caught them in a devastatingly precise crossfire. The second team, moving through what they thought was a blind spot in the defense, found themselves channeled into a killing zone where every angle had been calculated years in advance. "He's been waiting for this," Torres observed from his position in the clinic, where he monitored the battle through equipment disguised as medical sensors. Every renovation to the chapel, every community improvement project, he was building a fortress right under their noses. Above ground, Maria's cameras captured a new development. Black SUVs with diplomatic plates were converging on the neighborhood, carrying men whose authority came from places far beyond Chicago's jurisdiction. "They're here," she reported, "the ones who gave the orders in Kandahar." In the chapel basement, Sullivan faced a moment of decision. The files from Kandahar were secure in a hidden vault, their contents enough to shake governments and topple power structures that had stood for generations. But the price of revealing them would be paid in blood, not just his, but potentially That of every innocent in his congregation. Sometimes, he told Marcus, who stood ready with the files, the hardest part of serving God is knowing which truth to tell. His hand moved to the M1911 that had seen him through countless battles, and sometimes the only path to redemption is through the fire. Detective Chen, coordinating with her tactical teams, saw the larger pattern emerging. They're not just trying to bury the truth anymore, she realized. They're trying to bury the whole neighborhood, make it look like gang violence gone wrong, take everything down to the foundations. But what their enemies hadn't counted on was the way Sullivan's years of quiet ministry had transformed Hope's Cross. Throughout the neighborhood, people were moving with purpose, not running away, but taking up positions they'd been quietly trained for over years of community meetings that were more than they appeared. The shepherd prepared his flock, Marcus observed, watching ordinary citizens become an organized resistance through windows designed for exactly this purpose. All those self-defense classes, all those emergency preparedness drills, stay with us, because what happens next will show how one man's preparation for doomsday becomes a community's stand for justice. If this story has gripped you like it has our global audience, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss the moment when a neighborhood discovers that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but the truth it's meant to silence. The final confrontation at Hope's Cross Chapel would later be described in whispers, if at all, by those who witnessed it. If you haven't followed our story until now, you'll want to catch up, because what happened in those last hours would reshape not just Chicago's South Side, but the very nature of power and justice in shadows, where such things are measured in blood. Sullivan made his move as the ghost teams converged on the chapel, but not in any way their commanders had anticipated. Instead of meeting force with force, he stepped out onto the chapel steps alone and apparently unarmed, his preacher's collar stark white against his dark suit. 8 years ago, his voice carried clearly through the tense silence, 7 good men died, protecting a truth that some thought could stay buried. He held up a phone, its screen glowing in the gathering darkness. That truth just went live to 37 news outlets worldwide. In the FBI command center, Agent Kendricks watched as signals erupted across their monitoring stations. "He's not bluffing," she reported to Walsh. "The files are out, all of them. Financial records, surveillance footage, everything from Kandahar. And more. 8 years of accumulated evidence. My brothers didn't die for nothing," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying that same calm certainty he'd used in countless sermons. "They died so that this moment could come, so that men who thought themselves above justice would learn that even the highest thrones aren't beyond God's reach." The ghost teams held their positions, awaiting orders from handlers who were suddenly very busy dealing with explosive revelations halfway around the world. In that moment of hesitation, Sullivan's true masterstroke became clear. Throughout the neighborhood, lights began coming on in windows. Doors opened, ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, teachers, elderly residents, emerged with phones and cameras, recording everything. The kill zone their enemies had planned had become a fishbowl, with too many witnesses for any official explanation to cover. He didn't just build a fortress, Detective Chen realized, watching the community response unfold. He built a family. Every person who ever came to his soup kitchen, every kid he counseled, every soul he helped save, they're all part of the defense. The diplomatic vehicles that had arrived with such authority began to withdraw. The ghost teams, their mission compromised and their political coverage evaporating, melted away into the same shadows that had birthed them. In the end, the battle was won not with bullets, but with the very thing their enemies had tried to suppress: the truth. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Sullivan told the gathered community later that night, as news networks worldwide began reporting on the biggest political scandal in decades. but his justice, when it comes, is clear as dawn. Maria Gonzalez, watching from her store window as federal agents began the long process of securing evidence, saw something else. He never wanted just revenge, she told Marcus Williams. He wanted change, real change, the kind that comes from building something stronger than fear. In the chapel office, Sullivan finally allowed himself a moment of peace. The photo of his team in Kandahar had been joined by a new one, this time showing his congregation, his community, his new family of choice. Different kinds of warriors fighting different kinds of battles, but no less dedicated to the cause of justice. Was it worth the wait? Detective Chen asked him, looking at both photos. 8 years of building this, preparing for today? Sullivan's smile carried both satisfaction and a hint of the steel that had made him legendary. "The Lord teaches us patience," he replied, "and sometimes the best sermons are the ones that take years to deliver." The story of the preacher who never missed his mark would be told and retold in Chicago's South Side for years to come. But perhaps the real legend wasn't in the shots he took, but in the community he built. A fortress of faith and family, strong enough to withstand any storm. Remember, if this story touched your heart or taught you something about the power of patience and justice, make sure to like and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that redemption comes not just through faith, but through the unwavering dedication to see justice done, no matter how long it takes.